We got scarily good at waging war, right? There were, of course, the 2 world wars, but there were also many other very destructive smaller wars, and we can't forget that there were also genocides. But one of the most remarkable and often unnoticed aspects of the 20th century is the incredible number of peace, non-violence, and anti-war movements. Like, we know about Gandhi, but what makes the 20th century unique in history is that Gandhi wasn't unique. There was actually a surprisingly large number of peace and non-violence movements that were occurring all around the world. By 1900, Europeans pretty much dominated the world. Even though there had been relative peace in Europe since 1871, Europeans, using new weapons, had unleashed an incredible amount of violence everywhere else on the planet. They'd colonized most of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Americans had also expanded across the continental United States and were making eyes at the Caribbean and Asia. And I want to be clear that this conquest and colonization was consistently violent, but some people were beginning to question the very idea of violence itself. Like in his 1894 book, The Kingdom of God is Within You, Leo Tolstoy, who knew a little bit about war and peace, explored how Jesus' message to, quote, turn the other cheek, was the basis for a life of nonviolence. He argued that governments and individuals needed to give up violence if they believed themselves to be true Christians, and Tolstoy also saw nonviolence as a solution to ending colonialism. In 1908, Tolstoy wrote a letter to a Hindu, to Mohandas Gandhi, and in the letter he explained that Indians needed to confront British imperialism with love and nonviolence. Gandhi not only read that letter, he also published it in his South African newspaper Indian Opinion in 1909, and Tolstoy's ideas and his correspondence with Gandhi marked the beginning of an informal dialogue between advocates of nonviolence from around the world that spanned the 20th century. So for Gandhi, nonviolence was both a way of life and a tool for gaining Indian self-rule. He saw Western civilization as violent and exploitative. That's ridiculous. I know the Eurocentrists are going to get mad at me for saying that, but it is true. It's a smidge violent and exploitative at times. That said, well done with like market-based innovation and the Mona Lisa and etc. Okay, let's move on. Gandhi believed that Indians could reject that lifestyle and replace it with a non-violent one. And Gandhi also believed that Indians could bring about an end to British rule through a combination of ahimsa and satyagraha, a word often translated as adherence to truth. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. These interconnected ideas of ahimsa and satyagraha are best seen in the Salt March of 1930. So since the mid-19th century, the British had placed taxes on salt, and since salt, in addition to making food more delicious, is necessary to live, Gandhi saw these laws as a perfect example of how British despotism affected all Indians. Gandhi announced that he and a small group planned to march from his home in Ahmedabad to the coast in order to harvest salt. The march took almost 2 months and quickly gathered media attention from around the world, and the British Raj in India was forced to choose between arresting Gandhi for breaking a British law or else allowing him to break the law because he was harvesting salt illegally. Millions of Indians were inspired by Gandhi's challenge to British rule and began their own protests against the salt law. As civil disobedience spread across India, the British began to arrest people, and the international media focused even more on the protests, and popular opinion began to see British rule as unjust. By refusing to meet violent British rule with violence of his own and highlighting the injustice of British rule, Gandhi was able to use nonviolence as an effective tool in undermining the colonial regime. A.J. Muste and other members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and they spent much of the war protesting racial discrimination in the armed forces, but at the same time, Rustin was also becoming increasingly aware of the injustice of British colonialism in India and Africa, and began to protest that as well. And we see this global cross-fertilization of nonviolent ideas again in 1948, when Rustin traveled to India, where he met with many of Gandhi's associates. Gandhi had been killed in January of that year, and learned about the role of nonviolent protest against the British. And in the following decade, Rustin would teach Martin Luther King Jr. about Gandhi's tactics so he could use them in protesting against racial segregation in the United States. King himself traveled to India in 1959 to learn more about nonviolence, and before leaving, he explained that he was, quote, more convinced than ever before that the method of nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for justice and human dignity.